You're watching the Pacific Dialogue. This is our first episode of the year. I'm your host, James Chau, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome two very special guests. First over in Austin, David Firestein, who is the CEO and president of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. And all the way in Beijing, we're delighted to have Da Wei, who is a professor at the Department of International Relations and senior fellow at the Center for International Strategy and Security, both at Tsinghua University. Welcome very much to you both. Why don't we jump over to Austin first, where you are, David, at home, safe and very well, we hope, you and your family. I suppose the big question everyone wants to know in solidarity is, what does it feel like to be an American in February 2021?
Well, James, thank you. I have to say, personally, it feels really good to be on the other side of the Trump administration. It was a tough 4 years, I think, for our nation in the view of many of us in this country, not everyone, but certainly a good swath of the country. And I think we saw some things unfold during those 4 years that were very disturbing. And I think, frankly, very humbling for many of us as Americans. I think we have a new appreciation for the fragility of our system and for how important it is for us to be vigilant about sustaining the values that undergird our system. And so I think it's, for me, with a sense of relief that we've made it to February 2021. But at the same time, while I do feel some sense of hope and I think encouragement about the future, I also recognize that this is a really tough time for our nation. And we have 6.3% unemployment, millions of people out of work. We have 465,000 deaths due to COVID-19 so far and counting. And it is a very difficult time. And so there's a lot of promise, I think, in front of our nation, but a lot of hardship and challenge in the immediate term. And I think the American people are ready to roll up their sleeves and get to work dealing with those challenges.
I think the world is rooting for the American people, me certainly being British, Da Wei being Chinese. We're all part of this global humanity. Do you think, though, that there will be an opportunity to stretch this moment that we're in into long-term action, given all the constraints and damage caused already?
Yeah, I think for me, at least, I'm a researcher on China-US relations, follow these bilateral relations. And just as David said, after very difficult 4 years, that 4 years is not only difficult, I think, for the United States, it's also difficult for the bilateral relations. So for the 4 years now, the US have a new president and a new administration. And another thing is the pandemic. I think maybe we can be a little bit optimistic because now we have vaccine. Of course, we don't know how long can we go out of this tunnel, but it seems that we can see some light at the end of the tunnel. So those two things, I mean, new administration in Washington, D.C., and the vaccine development of the vaccine has brought me some hopes that maybe we can have a better year this year or maybe next year, and then try to particularly stabilize the bilateral relations. I'm talking about stabilizing the bilateral relations. I'm not saying bring the bilateral relations back to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think that's not that's not realistic. But at least we can stabilize the bilateral relations and prevent it from slip further into those, free fall trajectory. I think that's very, very dangerous. So I really cross my finger and hope that we can stabilize the bilateral relations in next 4 years.
This is so wonderful to hear, especially in this first episode of 2021. And we hear the United Nations talking about vaccine nationalism, vaccine apartheid, and even now a vaccine race that mimics, in a sense, the competition and aggression of the space race of the 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth. But do you think vaccines, David and Da Wei, do you think this could be actually the bridging point?
Well, James, I think it could be. I think with the right level of leadership and vision from the two national leaderships, I think COVID-19 actually could be an area where the United States and China could very fruitfully cooperate and do some great things for our two nations, our two peoples, and for the world. Unfortunately, it saddened me that from a US vantage point, the politics of China in the United States over these last 12 months and over the last several years have made it impossible politically, in a realistic sense, for the United States to look at the issue that way. And I think we've really missed an opportunity as a nation to actually come together with China and other countries in the world to try to get a handle on COVID-19. In the United States, we're seeing virtually a 911 every single day in terms of COVID-19 related deaths. We need to be working with the other nations of the world, including China. And I certainly hope that our national leadership starts to look at the issue that way. But I don't underestimate the challenges politically in the United States associated with doing that.
I mean, David, an add on over here. You talk about this 911 that is occurring every single day, and you talk about the future of this relationship. I'm worried that the lessons of the last 4 years are going to be on loop and repeat with this new administration. There's been indications from the Secretary of State and other figures that they will work with China in their own national interests. But there is still some of the same leftover rhetoric that's being used again.
Well, I think that's very true, James. And I would just say that I don't think we're going to see an overnight change. I think Dawei stated it really well, and I fully agree with him that what I think we can hope for realistically over the next coming months and years is a stabilization of the relationship, so that we can, kind of take stock of where we are, look in a more dispassionate way at how we can work together and where it makes sense to work together, while also addressing the challenges that are on the bilateral agenda. And to get away from the kind of rigid ideological and reflexive ideological approach that the United States certainly has adopted toward China in recent years. I think it is possible over the course of some months and certainly over this term as president, under President Biden's leadership, that we will move back in a more constructive direction that is rooted in self-interest and in the national interest, just as China's approach to the United States, I think, is also very appropriately rooted in its own national interest. And I think if we can get to that point, that would be progress relative to what we've seen over the last several years in this relationship.
By the way, let's look into the crystal ball, because you said that we're not going to go back 10 years to the good old days, but there could be a reset, there could be a different kind of positive relationship. If that were the case, if we say look at the 4 years ahead under this administration, what could be the pillar issues and what could be the highlights, good or not so good, that we can anticipate and prepare ourselves for?
I think, first of all, I think we need to be very cautious when we use the word reset. You use that word. I think probably China and the US cannot reset our bilateral relations. And also, it's actually, for me, it sounds not very good, because the Obama administration want to reset their relations with Russia, and it failed. So maybe, but anyway, I understand what you mean. I think look ahead, actually from now on to the middle of next year, I think that will be a critical period, because in the second half of next year, the US will have the midterm election, and here in China, we will have the 20th Party Congress. So both countries have major domestic political agenda. So if we can utilize the window of opportunity from now to the mid 2021 or 2022, and if the two sides can at least resume the dialogues, resume those so-called the important mechanism of dialogues. For instance, summit between the two leaders, and also the dialogues between the two governments. We used to have a lot. We used to have more than 100. We have too many at that. We had too many at that time, but now we have almost zero. So we need to set up the normal mechanism for the two countries to have diplomatic dialogues, to have dialogues, and to have dialogues over economic and trade issues. And also we need to have the dialogues over the people-to-people exchanges. I think those are I call those four as four pillars of the two countries' relations. We need to grasp this opportunity and to set up those pillars. So with those pillars, though we cannot bring the bilateral relations back to the old days, at least we can stabilize that. So when we get to 2024, we may have a stable but not very friendly, but it's a stable relations between 2024. If we miss this opportunity, probably we will see a more dangerous bilateral relations by the year 2024, because after 4 years test and try, then both sides feel that we failed, we cannot fix the problem, then I think we will again step into very, very bad situation.
So for all of us to understand, let's avoid the word reset because of the connotations of that. And you say, Dawei, perhaps look at stabilizing. Let's learn how to crawl before we can walk, so to speak. Thanks for that. I want to look to our past, because the past has been good and there's been many great highlights that we can look back on. And of course, David, you are one of the key figures with Neil Bush at the George H.W. Bush Center. I happen to have a copy of his book here, which documents his very rich time in China, especially in Beijing, where he served as a diplomat. And on the front cover, he says this, the president says, "I was a big believer then and still am that personal diplomacy can be very useful and productive." We saw that with Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter. And we saw that, of course, with President George H.W. Bush. To both of you, are there any figures at this current time who have the skill, opportunity, and timing to do as they did before?
Well, I would say, I think your point is really well taken, James, that the personal touch at the top level of diplomacy can really make a decisive difference. And we've seen that throughout history. You've noted some of those examples. And I think you're absolutely right that George H.W. Bush had an incredible deftness in his ability to bring people together, to be able to look at issues from perspectives other than his own, and to have an appreciation for where diplomatic partners, in particular China, was kind of coming from culturally and politically. And that informed his ability to be an extremely visionary president when it came to managing the US-China relationship during a difficult time in the relationship. And so those skills are really important. I think President Biden has a lot of those skills. He doesn't have, I think, perhaps the depth of understanding relative to China that George H.W. Bush did when he entered the Oval Office, because, as you rightly noted, George H.W. Bush had lived in China for 15 months before he became president. I think he's the only president in U.S. history of which that can be said. And he brought some very deep insights about China, about its strategic intentions, about its culture into the Oval Office. And I think our nation was the better for those insights, having been a part of his presidency. But that being said, I think Joe Biden is a bridge builder. I think his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is very experienced and very measured and is not ideological, but rather is focused, like President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris and the administration, on U.S. interests. And I think just getting back to a mindset of advancing U.S. interests would itself be a significant departure from what we saw during the Trump administration. And I think it would be a departure that would serve the United States in good stead. And so I do see figures that should be able to manage this very difficult and challenging relationship fairly well. George H.W. Bush is really a once in a lifetime kind of a president when it comes to his depth of understanding about China and his vision in terms of geopolitics. I mean, it was just unrivaled. That being said, I think that our nation is in pretty good hands right now. And I certainly hope and wish for the administration to have success dealing with this most consequential bilateral relationship.
With due respect, I do want to say something. I have a little bit different idea with David and James. I think, of course, I agree that those political leaders and key figures will play an important role. But probably we won't have a George H.W. Bush or Henry Kissinger this time. This is not their faults. I mean, in 1970s and in 1980s, there was we call structural reason behind the opening up of China and the establishment of the bilateral relations. So both China and the US we have some strategic needs in the Cold War. We need to work together, coping with the threat from the Soviet Union. And then in 1990s, I think again, we have some structural demands that we want to accelerate the globalization, and then the two countries can benefit from that process. But now I think the challenge is this: we don't have that structural overlapping interests, but we have structural challenges. Yeah, challenges. The US view China as rising power, challenging power, while China view the US as a existing power which want to suppress its rise. So this is the basic reason of current difficulties. So key figures, of course, they can play a role, but I do agree with David that I think their role are more or less manage the bilateral relations, manage these difficult relations. So in that sense, I agree with two of you. I think President Biden and his team are all very professional statesmen and also diplomats. And President Biden spent a lot of time with President Xi. They know each other. So I think those are opportunities that maybe the statesmen, the political leaders from the two countries can work together to manage these bilateral relations. But we won't have a George H.W. Bush, we won't have a Kissinger who can, just slip the whole bilateral relations. I think that's impossible now. I'm sorry to say that.
Well, of course, there were a whole host of Chinese figures at those corresponding times. Deng Xiaoping, the vice premier, Zhou Enlai, and many others, of course. But, David, you mentioned the word bridge builder, and Dawei, you're sitting in front of a bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, which Chinese laborers and Chinese talent helped to build. And of course, that was a very complex time over immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Those painful memories are being resurrected all over again through the language that former President Trump, introduced into the daily rhetoric. Joe Biden says that to his staffers, disrespect will not be tolerated. You'll be fired if you're found to misbehave. Does his first action then need to be, especially at this time of the Lunar New Year, a time of renewal and goodwill, that he should remove this language permanently and officially from the American people?
Well, I think there's no question that much of the language that President Trump himself utilized and that people around President Trump, such as the former Secretary of State, other White House advisors, and allies in Congress, that language was disgusting, it was wrong, and it should not be employed. It is racially tinged, if not outright racist. But the cynical use of these repugnant and deplorable terms, unscientific terms about the virus, for the purpose of casting blame and demonizing, I think is very much beneath the office of President of the United States. And many in this country, myself included, have repeatedly called out that kind of deplorable rhetoric every time we've seen it. And I think what we have with President Biden is a president that understands that real presidents don't communicate that way. They don't lead that way. It's wrong. It is divisive, and it's unproductive. And I think what President Biden is doing is leading by example, which is something that I think is a very important power of the presidency. So it's not so much a question of whether President Biden mandates the use of this term or mandate or prohibits the use of that term. By his own example, President Biden will restore dignity to presidential communications and maturity to presidential communications that I think is very badly needed in the wake of 4 years of really juvenile and very disrespectful styles of communication that were unpresidential and really shameful. And I think that through his example, President Biden is setting the tone right at the beginning of his administration that this kind of language is unacceptable in his administration. And I salute that leadership on President Biden's part.
It has impacted not only Americans who are of Chinese descent and East Asian descent, some of whom have been verbally, physically assaulted, some of them who have been murdered on the suspicion of racial ties. It has impacted people like me who are British, but also very proud to be Chinese, who feel very much that this goes back to the colonial mindset of countries like the UK where we grew up. I was just wondering then, as a Chinese in China at this very important time, Dawei, how does this talk of viruses and our eating habits, our alleged eating habits, our alleged lack of civilization, how does that make you feel as an ordinary Chinese?
Of course, this kind of languages, this kind of terms, some Western leaders used, I think, make us feel uncomfortable and angry, I will say, particularly in past year, in the year 2019, I think angered many Chinese. And I think that's also a reason behind the two countries' very harsh diplomatic, how to say that, a diplomatic war or battle of the rhetoric, battle of the discourse. For instance, China's foreign spokesperson used very strong wording, criticize the American counterparts, and the American side do the same thing. I think now I'm very glad that President Biden made a very correct decision. And I think now it's time for the two sides to stop using those harsh wording and blaming each other. I think it's time for quiet and nuanced diplomatic maneuvers rather than microphone diplomacy. So I hope that I think the U.S. side has already made a correct decision. So I hope that will be a starting point that we can scale down our battle of rhetoric between the two countries and do some real things, roll up our sleeves and do something real, I think.
I'm so glad that you said that, because the language that enrages me and millions and billions of other people also has to be offset by a dial down in language from China. There's been some very, very tough rhetoric coming from that side as well. You pointed it out, Dawei. since we've got that out of the way and since we're amongst friends, let's inject a tone now of evidence-based optimism. And the biggest issue, I think, impacting humanity today is climate change. And we've seen them work so brilliantly on this together towards the formation and then the ratification of the Paris Agreement in 2015 and 2016, and with the same set of people who are now in power on both sides. Do you think we're going to see climate change as the big issue, the big burning issue that they actually do come together on? And I think they've said something to that effect, haven't they, David?
Well, James, I think you make a great point. This is a really profound global challenge. By definition, it is a challenge that no one country has the ability to meet on its own. And literally, the world community has to come together to address this challenge, or else it's not going to get addressed effectively. And obviously, under the Trump administration, the United States pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and simply didn't embrace this notion of working with other nations to address climate change. And as you rightly pointed out, the Obama-Biden administration viewed it very differently. And now we have President Biden, and President Biden has, on his first day in office, if memory serves, got the United States, or signaled the intention to get the United States back into the Paris Climate Accord. And I do think this issue, among others, and it's not the only one, can be a great area for U.S.-China collaboration that really is focused on bottom line results and improving the quality of lives of people around the world, including in the United States and in China, but the world over. It's a great issue for these two countries to work on, because these two countries are decisive players on issues of relating to the climate and in terms of the industrial emissions and so on. And the bottom line is, without the United States and China, along with other nations working together, we can't get our arms around this problem. So I think it can become a positive focal point for collaboration that's meaningful and that's results oriented and that focuses on making people's lives better. And I wouldn't understate the difficulty politically of getting, from a US standpoint, to a place where we can see that clearly. But I think any objective and dispassionate observer that's not coming at the US-China relationship through an ideological prism recognizes that this area is a great area to serve as a kind of rallying point, one among others, in an otherwise very strained relationship. And I hope that we'll see both countries move in that more constructive direction around climate change and around a series of other global challenges as well.
I mean, Dawei, you're working also as Senior Fellow at the Center for International Strategy and Security, which is a big component around climate change. What are your thoughts around this issue in this context?
Yeah, of course. I totally agree with David. I think the climate change is probably the biggest opportunity for the US and China to work together. And this issue is in the interest of both countries and the whole world. So it's really something we have to work together. And climate change is a security issue, and it is a strategic issue. It's not something, usually we call it non-traditional security issue. But actually now today, I think it's not very meaningful to distinguish traditional or non-traditional. I think it's as important, equally important, like as the military threat, this kind of thing. The two countries really need to work together. And again, I also agree with David. I think it's not easy, though we both sides agree. It's an area that we can cooperate, but technically speaking, the goal is very, very challenging. For instance, are we going to set our goal from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees? I think the US want to do that, and it's mean a lot for China's economic development. Whether China can agree or not, I'm not sure. And also, China, of course, also declared a very ambitious climate control goals, but how can China achieve that? It's also not very clear yet. So we still need very tough and hard work together to achieve our goals. And another thing is the climate change issue is not in the vacuum. It may be impacted by other issues like ideology, geopolitical issues. So I really want the two countries to singulate this issue. We cannot link all the issues together, or we can do nothing. I think we need to singulate this issue from other issues. Let's cooperate over this. While, of course, in other areas, we have maybe conflicts, for instance, geopolitics, but let's cooperate as well as when we have some kind of conflicts. So make sure that we can make progress, because this is not it's a responsibility for the two countries, but it's also a responsibility for the whole world, for the human being.
Dawi, can I quickly come to you with another thought? Should we be very concerned by what's happening in Myanmar? We see that people are out protesting on the streets. We know that China and, of course, the United States both have strong interests not only in the country, but in the region as a whole. Mike Lampton, David Shambaugh have new books on American China in Southeast Asia. I mean, what should we be looking for here? And what are you looking at?
I think they probably on this issue, China and other countries have slightly different positions. For instance, with the US, I think our positions are slightly different. Of course, we want Myanmar's situation to be stable, and we had very good relations with the civil government. I think we worked together very well at that time. But now this new situation happened. From our perspective, I think all those elements are friends of China. We want them to solve their problem by themselves, and we want them to keep the stable situation in Myanmar. So China has a very long tradition of non-intervention. So we think this is internal affair of Myanmar. So we really hope the two sides, the military and the civil elected leaders can solve the problem by themselves, and we don't want to intervene into the Myanmar domestic situation. I think this is a long Chinese tradition, but that does not mean we support one side or we don't support the other side. I don't think so.
David, I mean, equally, what are your thoughts on this? Because you're not just a figure who's out over in Austin, where I believe you actually grew up, but you're someone who spent and invested a lot of your life as a career diplomat in Asia, particularly in China. So you understand some of the inner muscles at work over here.
Well, I think, James, the situation in Myanmar, certainly from an American perspective, is troubling and concerning. And obviously, I think David Dawe has accurately summarized the distinction between the United States and China in terms of perspective on Myanmar. China traditionally comes at these issues from a perspective of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. The United States tends to be more vocal in expressing concern or even alarm at developments that are occurring domestically within countries, and that certainly happened in this case. Anytime, from an American perspective, that you have a democratically elected government or group of representatives overthrown by a military junta, that's problematic in itself. And so I think there is a divergence in perspective on this particular issue, but at the same time, I don't think it is an issue that is going to surface on the U.S.-China bilateral agenda per se, simply because there's so many other really challenging and pressing issues that are currently on the bilateral issue that really crowd out virtually everything else. That while there may be differences of perspective around this particular topic or many others, they don't rise to the level of anything that would cause any further perceptible turbulence in the U.S.-China relationship. So, yes, I think it's true that the United States and China come at what's happening in Myanmar from different angles and with different lenses. But I think one thing that I'm sure the United States and China both want to see is restraint on all sides, stability, and in the case of the United States, due accord and due weight given to those who were elected by the people of Burma to be able to serve in the positions in which they were elected to serve. But the good news is I don't think this will be another issue on the U.S.-China agenda because we've already got enough issues to worry about at this point.
It's a very, very full plate indeed, be it climate change, a trade dispute that we didn't even get round to speak about. And I love that moment, David, where you called Dawei David, because of course, Dawei is often the Chinese name that Davids use when they are in China. It's a wonderful testament to the insight that both of you bring as individuals, and of course, at the friendship that you bring and gift us today on the Pacific Dialogue. Professor Dawei in Beijing, David Firestein over in Austin in the United States, I thank you both very much for the honor of sharing this time with you today.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, James.